Hello everyone, and welcome to this debate / conversation with the headline, "The Green Transition as Class Struggle." Here on stage I have three prominent guests to discuss the topic with me. First, Matt Huber, an assistant professor at, a professor at Syracuse University, who's written two incredible books. One about oil politics called Lifeblood, which made me understand how deeply connected welfare capitalism and oil is, and how fucking hard it will be to decarbonize the energy system. And his latest, Climate Change as Class War, here. A quite unique book about how to get a working class-led green transition. He's also a contributor to the left-wing magazine Jacobin. Second, Julia Nordblad, an historian of ideas at Uppsala University. Julia is a critic of the status quo and has written about the different temporalities of climate change. And last, Staffan Lestadius, a retired professor in industrial economics, who has written a three-part essay on the green transition, which I personally think is the best thing that has been written in Swedish about the green transition. Welcome to all three of you. So, I've asked you to start with a little speech for about 7 minutes long. And the question is, in what way do we need to change the society / the system to tackle climate change? And I start with you, Matt. In you say you have two words for it. You talk about the green transition and the more radical variant, the green transformation. Is that correct? Sure. Which one do you prefer? Which one is possible?
Well, it's going to have to be a green transformation, I think. It's a very big transformation, yeah. Should I go ahead? Sure. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. Really nice audience on a Tuesday night, so thank you all for being here. I think the year 2022 tells us really all we need to know about what we need to do to address this climate crisis we're in and the prospect of a green transition. Right now, fossil fuels are booming. They're as profitable as ever. And just over the summer, U.S. News and World Report basically did an analysis of the top 10 performing stocks of 2022, and 8 of them are connected to the fossil fuel industry in some way. You may have seen that just on Friday, ExxonMobil announced once again that they've had record profits. So it seems entirely clear that those that profit from the production of fossil fuels are going to continue to do so unless we can find some sort of political force capable of stopping them. So this is fundamentally a question of power. And so I argue in the book the power struggle is really not as much about believing science or what your carbon footprint is. It's a class struggle over who controls industrial production. And while understanding class as a relationship to the means of production sounds like an old-fashioned socialist type of rallying cry, I argue this is what characterizes the nature of what we need to do to solve climate change. We need to rapidly shift our industrial production system off of fossil fuels. Ultimately, the core argument is that we've built a climate movement that really lacks right now the capacity to build that kind of power. And because it's a movement that's largely entrenched in a minority of society and the highly educated professional classes, people, credentialed folks with degrees like scientists, journalists, people that work for non-governmental organizations, government workers, and that we really need to be able to build a much broader mass coalition that has popular majoritarian appeal amongst the wider working class. And one of the key problems with our climate politics today is we're often told that responsibility for climate change is on all of us, right? It's rooted in our individual carbon footprints. It's how we consume, how we drive cars, heat our homes, eat meat. And then from this analysis, the problem is seen as a problem of kind of rich consumers. But giving all of us in this room 100% of the carbon footprint, I would argue, erases the capitalists who make huge profits actually selling us the fuel and the meat and the stuff that people consume. Villainizing rich consumers also ignores how rich people become rich in the first place. A CEO of a fossil fuel company, they might be a vegetarian and take public transit and have a low carbon footprint, but they're still, we would agree, a huge driver of the climate crisis. And to understand how they drive it, we need to concentrate on their ownership and investment power over production. And I actually think this way of thinking about climate clarifies our political task. Instead of this sort of moral project of converting the lifestyles of billions of dispersed consumers, we face a perhaps harder but more straightforward task of eroding the political power of a class of owners who really run production systems like aviation, automobiles, steel, chemicals, and they run those things for profit, and that's the class we actually need to confront. Meanwhile, the professional class climate movement does not see this as much as a kind of material struggle over production, but a struggle over knowledge, over belief or denial in the science. Professional class climate activists also often worry about their own material privilege and blame themselves for climate breakdown, as opposed to blaming, again, the capitalist owners who are really profiting off this disaster. And as such, professional class climate politics often calls for what I call in the book a politics of less, of lowering consumption, of degrowth, and this kind of stuff. Both focusing on knowledge and believing science or a politics of less, I argue, fails to really resonate with the broader masses who are struggling to make ends meet in an increasingly barbaric and unequal capitalist system under sort of neoliberal capitalism. And so there's a reason why in France, the yellow vest activists shouted in their rallies, quote, "Politicians only care about the end of the world, but we care about the end of the month," right? So the answer that I advocate is a working class politics that appeals to the material interest of the vast majority of society, of everyday working people in capitalist societies. Now, academics often frame environmental interest in terms, sort of in abstract terms of saving a distant nature or more narrow struggles over concrete environmental issues like pollution or land dispossession. But the majority of workers under capitalism face a pretty straightforward threat to their ecological survival. It's the market. It's the struggle to obtain the very basics of life ecologically and trying to earn enough money to survive in a highly, again, unequal capitalist system. So I argue this kind of proletarian economic insecurity should be the platform upon which we build a broader climate and ecological politics. And I think it's actually convenient that the very sectors that we need to transform to solve climate change are things like energy, housing, transportation. And those are direct, clear working class needs that people actually struggle to obtain. So we could tie decarbonization to this kind of cheaper or even decommodified or free access to these basic needs. And this could be combined with a kind of Green New Deal program of large-scale public investment and a jobs program that's building out the new infrastructure that we need and could help stitch together a broader climate coalition. So another key problem that requires political power to solve is that the main barrier, one of the main barriers we face for climate action is that many of the known and existing technological solutions are not deployed in our society for one reason: they're not profitable to investors who control the production of these things. Uppsala professor Brett Christophers, he has done some research that shows renewables are very cheap, actually, but they're actually still not very profitable for investors, and therefore there's really a lack of investment. But similar lack of profitability and too costly problems beset other technologies like green hydrogen, carbon removal, storage technology, and nuclear power. Any sort of various forms of low carbon options are seen as too costly, not profitable to investors. So that's a problem of capitalism and one we need to overcome. So if we really think this is a planetary emergency, we need to deploy technologies on the basis of planetary need, not private profit. And you can look into history. Societies did not build massive public health infrastructure like sewage treatment plants because it was profitable to capital. They built these infrastructures to solve a larger public crisis of like waterborne diseases in cities and things like this. So that's how we have to see this problem. But again, a massive climate public investment program would require state power, and that's power that the climate movement right now really lacks. And as such, politicians in the state still largely subscribe to the delusion that we can just trust private capital and the market to solve this problem for us, which we've been hoping will happen for many decades at this point. Finally, I also argue in the book we can't ignore the workers and unions that are at the heart of this energy transition and industrial transition. Really, the linchpin of any decarbonization strategy is the electric utility sector, electricity. And actually, electricity in the United States, and I'm sure Sweden, is already one of the more unionized and organized parts of the entire economy. But moreover, I mean, decarbonizing the economy and doing this transformation or green transition is going to require a massive build out of all sorts of other infrastructure like transmission lines, green public housing, public transit. So I actually think there's an opportunity here that this sort of climate politics of building new infrastructure, not quite a traditional environmental politics of blocking infrastructure. This politics of building has a capacity to win over more traditional, powerful unions in what we call the building trades, right, and construction industries. And at least in the United States, it stands that right now the renewable energy industry is actually owned by Wall Street, and it's extremely anti-union, extremely capitalist. So the climate transition or the green transition need not automatically benefit workers and unions. And so we can make a case to them that we need to engage these workers and unions in a kind of class struggle and make a pitch to the unions that really this climate transition is a matter of their own survival if they aren't thinking strategically about how to insert themselves in the transition and make sure it's a union one. So this is going to take a lot of struggle, but as a famous person said, we have a world to win, but we also have a world that we need to save at this point, so we really need to get going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I have a lot of questions about that, but we'll continue with Julia. In what way do we need to change the society, the system, to tackle climate change?
Thank you. So I thought that what I would spend my 7 minutes on would be to articulate the degrowth case, because I think that could be actually a good contribution to the discussion we're having here. So I would make a version of that case in the following way. So we are on a pathway of climate change and environmental degradation that will transform this planet in ways we do not understand and cannot predict. So we are compromising our support of food and fresh water. We are making large areas of the world uninhabitable. And as a result of these new strains, we make the world much more insecure and volatile, and we increase the risk for conflict, catastrophe, human suffering, and so on. So to limit this, we need to cut emissions drastically, emissions of greenhouse gases, and we are not by far on the right track to doing that. And Sweden, as an example, Sweden's emissions rose by 4% last year. So yeah, we're not on the right track, to state the obvious. So the degrowth case would be that it is clear that GDP, BNP, correlates with carbon dioxide emissions. And since the mid-20th century, economic growth, so just economic growth as a whole, of the economy as a whole, has been made the overall target of politics on the national level, but also in international organizations and in the frameworks for development in countries of the global south. So development is GDP growth in this day. And this model is untenable since it produces climate change, which threatens society as a whole. So the promise of green growth and decoupling, that GDP can continue to grow while environmental degradation goes down, has yet to materialize on a convincing and consistent scale. So according to the degrowthers, the conclusion one must draw from this is that GDP growth can no longer be the overarching goal for politics in the global north. And part of this is an historical insight that the focus on overall GDP as the framework for all politics is a very recent one. And that means that it is not natural, it is not necessary, and it's perfectly possible to orient politics toward a different goal. Degrowthers also argue that there is indeed enough to go around for everyone on a global scale. It is possible to have to produce food and energy for everyone to have a good standard of living. And the issue is that of distribution. And that one could perhaps argue might be a somewhat harder problem than perhaps the degrowthers see it as. But yeah, we'll just bracket that and hand it over to Matt. So to achieve more equal distribution globally, that means that countries like Sweden or the US must lower their environmental impact, their GDP, aggregate GDP, so that there is space for other countries to expand to a more tolerable level. So instead of just growing GDP, global north countries must redistribute wealth, but also rethink it. So it is a central point here that the direction of the economy or society cannot just be left to the market, but priorities have to be set politically. So it's not about growing GDP in the aggregate, but it's also not about just shrinking GDP in the aggregate. Rather, it is about leaving the focus on GDP altogether and instead identify particular functions in the economy or social goods, amenities, and these can be produced and find ways of producing these at a lower environmental cost, so more efficiently, as it were. So let's take an example, because this is getting abstract. So the goal is to lower emissions, so we start with the high-emitting sectors like transportation. So that amounts to, I think, 15% of global emissions, and perhaps 20% in this country. Correct me if I'm wrong. So it's a sizable chunk, and it's an important part of emissions, but it's also an important part of the political problem, because as Matt also cited, increasing fuel taxes, for example, have generated popular pushbacks, most notoriously in France, but also here in this election cycle. You know, the sort of extreme focus on gas prices in this latest election in Sweden is an example of that. So the mainstream idea, or the eco-modernist idea, or green growth idea, would be that we sort of push for electrification of the vehicle fleet so that people buy electric cars instead. But this is not a credible path, the degrowthers would say, simply because it hasn't given us any evidence to support that it would work. And also, for example, at the moment, the ever-increasing size and weight of cars, so the rise of SUVs, for example, has cancelled or eaten up all the emission savings that have yet been done by electrification. So the social good or the amenity that we are after is not a private motorized vehicle for everyone, but rather something like mobility. So the answer here is cheap for some free and efficient public transportation. And this is not to tell you that public transportation is important, because I think you know that, but it's just an illustration of a degrowth way of seeing how societies can indeed be transformed. So as you can now tell, I think there are some important similarities with what Matt has been saying, and that is a point that I think I will return to, but thank you.
I would like you to start a debate now, but I would also like to hear what Staffan has to say about it.
Thank you. I've been given the right-wing position in this panel. Okay. I will use my 7 minutes to make an introduction which partly relates to both these, but somewhat more also. Mankind is presently heading towards a global catastrophe. We are rapidly reducing biodiversity towards the 6th extinction of species, and we are emitting greenhouse gases in a speed and magnitude that will cause global atmospheric temperature to increase more than 2 centigrades, probably 3 centigrades, before the year 2100. That will create a planet far beyond what human civilization has experienced before, and take us into a territory of hitherto unknown frequencies and magnitudes of extreme weather and sea levels. This anthropogenic transformation of the planet can be followed in real time and has been followed for several decades. This year, for example, the international community of climate scientists and organizations have published more than half a dozen heavy reports with all the relevant details. Last week, we received 3 alarming texts revealing the gap between what is done and what has to be done to keep us within reasonable planetary boundaries. To keep atmospheric temperature increase below 1.5 centigrades, countries have to speed up their reduction paths 7-fold. That will not happen. Why is it so that we, globally as well as locally, do so little to reduce the risks of human suicide we are facing? The answer to that is more complex than the simplistic thing that it is a struggle between capitalists and working class. What has to be changed to speed up the processes of mitigation and adaptation? In the final 6 minutes of my introduction, I will focus on a meta-level analysis on what has to be done. For the full version, I recommend my books, which are for sale down there. The climate crisis has its origin, its legitimacy, and is fueled in the model natural philosophy. Among scientists like Francis Bacon, in the Enlightenment, and in the emerging dominant thought style that man is master of nature. As we have a Marxian touch in this seminar, we can say that the superstructure of ideas has conditioned, facilitated, and enforced the socioeconomic basis, the capitalist development. Marx never imagined this kind of causality. Not the least, with the help of fossil fuels, did the system deliver? During the great acceleration after World War II, an everlasting growing input of carbon made it possible to expand the use of natural resources into exponential rates, to increase productivity and to create wealth. In the welfare societies that grew out of this, everyone, capitalists, workers, professionals, politicians, became beneficiaries and dependents of growing amounts of fossil fuels. The system was lubricated by coal and oil. Class struggle was reduced by carbon. You may say that we were all bribed, but not by intention. This is now the situation. It is difficult, to say the least, to get broad acceptance for policies which may take us away from the present path towards a catastrophe. Like the frog in the bath tube, we all enjoy the lukewarm water, which slowly becomes warmer and warmer. A large majority believes that it will be losers in leaving the lifestyle it has obtained. There is thus an enormous need for mobilization, for visions and socio-economic creativity to show that there are sustainable and non-fossil-based alternative futures. The problem is that the window of opportunity to turn the rudder into a new course is rapidly diminishing. There are additional obstacles in the work to get acceptance for radical climate policies. Many belong to the realm of equality. To move away from our dependence on carbon is challenging and risky for many of us. We want guarantees that all the others will share the burden. In a world of inequality between individuals as well as countries as regards income, property and possibilities, people will not cooperate unless they feel that the transformation is fair. As a consequence, there is a need for radical distribution policies in combination with transformation to a post-fossil lifestyle. There is very little seen about that in present policies. As I have argued, the climate crisis has its intellectual legitimacy above the level of class conflict, above the level of class struggle, in our thought style of man as master of nature. It is thus not a question of left and right. In addition, most human activities cause carbon dioxide emissions, not only those in the realm of production. The fact that the climate crisis, as noted earlier, is situated in a realm above the power relations in society challenges our conventional political wisdoms. It challenges our backbone reaction in what policy to perform. It could create opportunities, this, but hitherto I haven't seen that kind of opportunity out of those challenges. In short, and consequently, a transformation to socialism will not solve the problem and will not even get wide support. Strong focus on such a policy may delay the necessary transformation. The transformation ahead must be rapid and based on the institutions we have, whether we like them or not. It must be enforced by a strongly regulating state that sets the rules and restrictions and conditions for actors and also creates incentives to transform. Similar to our earlier experiences of structural change, the system has to be lubricated to help all those with fine-tuning policies, to help all those who may fall between the chairs. This approach of a regulated transformation to a post-fossil economy necessitates a radical break with the neoliberal tendencies which have dominated the post-World War world. Much of the conventional wisdom which has grown under the umbrella of neoliberalism, not the least related to world markets and globalization, must be challenged. The details of that fall outside my introduction. The alarming difference of the transformation now compared to the structural transformation in the 1960s in our country is that by then the political leaders explicitly mobilized for change. Now they all, from left to right, say that we will not suffer. We will not suffer from climate transformation. We will not suffer from the big European war. Don't worry, life will be as usual. No change at all. That is simply not true. The coming post-fossil society will and must be totally different. And the politicians have to help us to get there instead of reducing our electricity bills. With one exception, I will not analyze the present look-alike populism further here. The exception relates to my impression that our political elite has lost their visions, and related to that its capacity to mobilize for change. Maybe also its capacity to understand basic science. Others may discuss those questions further. Here, I finish my presentation with some comments on the transformation we have ahead of us. As I said earlier, climate crisis is not a question of capitalism or socialism. We have to transform our present capitalist system from a fossil dependency to a post-fossil economy. All activities, whether they label them production or consumption, have to be carbon-free in all segments of society. Neither is this primarily a question of growth or degrowth. This is structural change which should be in focus. Fossil-based activities must be reduced in a speed of at least 7% annually. No long-term goals are accepted, 7% annually. All over the economy with no exception. Parallel, you may increase non-fossil-based activities to compensate for the lost ones. These are the political action parameters. Reduce carbon-based activities and build sustainable ones. In reality, you can probably not combine an annual reduction of carbon dioxide emissions in the magnitude of 7% with continued economic growth, which historically has been based on an annual increase of fossil fuels in more or less the same magnitude. So, degrowth is not an action parameter. However, you have to transform irrespective of whether you can enter it as growth in the national accounts or not. Degrowth may be an outcome, so also no growth or slow growth. I stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have like two big subjects here to talk about. Is climate change, about capitalism or socialism, and or is it about growth or degrowth or structural change? And maybe I start with the question about class struggle and capitalism and socialism. And feel free to reply to each other in your answers here. So, Matt, I think a lot of persons have a hard time to understand how class struggle is related to the green transformation, and especially how do we use it for gain? Like a question is like, why would unions be green? You talked about unions in your speech, and maybe you can mention a very interesting article I read about you that's called "No Shortcuts" in Jacobin magazine.
Yeah, sure. So just to kind of, I think, just to like sort of lay out some things we agree on, I think both of you said we need massive redistribution of wealth, and I think obviously I agree with that. And so there's a lot of commonality on that front. I just think we have to like look into history and try to ask ourselves, under what circumstances has a capitalist society gone through massive waves of the redistribution of wealth? And really, when we look, we see cases basically when working class unions, parties were able to build sufficient power to force capital and the wealthy to succumb to a regime of political economy that was based on massive levels of redistribution of wealth. So this happened really only once in the history of capitalism. Thomas Piketty calls it the great exception. It's essentially mid-20th century, where the working class was so powerful that there were incredibly high tax rates and incredibly powerful unions that took eroded the power of capital to create a compromised but relatively more equal type of capitalism. So this kind of huge structural transformation or massive redistribution, that only happens if we confront the power of the people that control our economy right now, which is owners of capital that are seeking profits on their investments, and that's their focus. And they have organized very well for the last 4 or 5 decades to create a political economy that's basically geared toward their benefit. So the top, again, Piketty, look at his research, the top 1%, top 0.1% is benefiting tremendously from an arrangement where tax rates have been lowered, union power has been crushed, state welfare spending eviscerated. So if we're gonna embark on this structural transformation, we're gonna have to take on the power of the people who control the economic system which is driving this climate crisis. And I can say one last thing, which is that we actually, I would argue, don't live in a society that is run on or focused on, it's focused on, but it's not structurally bound by GDP growth. GDP growth is someone I actually listened called it an epiphenomenal aspect of capitalism. It's sort of a thing on the surface of society that's an indirect measure of all of the goods and services traded in an economy. It's trying to kind of indirectly measure, is the economy healthy? And yes, politicians focus on it, but I think it obscures the fact that we actually live in an economy where what really drives the economy is, again, owners of capital who are seeking profits and returns and growth on their investments, and that's where the power is. And there's, no state has ever passed a policy of we must have GDP growth. It's just this sort of cultural, surface level thing that we obsess over. But again, if you want to create a society that isn't focused on GDP growth, you actually have to confront the power of the people who tell us that we need a society that grows, which really means we need a society where capital is growing. They're making profits, they're making returns on investments, and the idea is that that kind of trickles down to all of us. They hire people, they create jobs, all the good stuff that we need. So finally, the unions question. Again, I think this is ultimately a industrial transformation that we have to go through. We have, for basically 200 plus years, created an economy that is at a very basic level run on fossil fuels and carbon-based energy. And that's what we call the Industrial Revolution. It's when we shifted toward fossil fuels and industrial machinery. And so if we're going to transform this highly industrial system, as socialist, I believe that the workers in the system that have the skills and knowledge about how those systems work, they're going to have structural power to be able to organize and push for a transition to a new system. And like I said in the talk, that although we know a lot of the unions are quite hostile to certain aspects of environmentalism, particularly in the United States, when you get activists blocking pipelines and blocking fossil fuel infrastructure, they're going to be not friendly to that kind of environmentalism. But I do think that if we really were to build the power to do this kind of structural transformation that is going to have to be about, and as they said in the Labor Party, a like third or fourth industrial revolution, right? A complete restructuring of our industrial system, then the unions know they would have a lot to gain from that kind of transformation, and therefore it would be in their interest to make sure that transformation is not towards a right to work and anti-union type of economy, but a union-based transition. And I should also add that we're going to have natural allies in the union movement in what I would call low-carbon sectors. So in the United States, when the Green New Deal was announced, the first people who endorsed it were nurses unions, teachers unions, low-carbon types of care work and education work. And so whatever the union labor movement aspect of climate change is going to have to be a coalition between these kind of low-carbon unions and the workers that are in the belly of the beast, that basically know how electricity systems work, know how these industrial systems work, and that it's really their power we need to win over, I think.
Well, the biggest, your biggest union, the big industrial union, which have a couple of letters, I don't know, CIO.
AFL-CIO.
They were opposed to the Green New Deal, weren't they? Because it was not too GDP positive.
Could be.
So everything is connected. Okay, feel free to reply. Yeah,
can I reply?
Julia.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it was very useful to read your book, Matt, and you bring out some really pertinent questions, I think, for the green movement, like those questions of power and how the climate movement can actually start winning, and to really think about power, and it also seems very useful to think along those historical lines and with those historical analogies and also historical theories. And also to ask the kinds of questions you just asked, like when has redistribution actually happened and so on. But history doesn't necessarily repeat itself exactly, so there is a possibility that this situation might be slightly different at least, and that perhaps the green movement has, some kind of point, or is not, just to be put in the bin. And I think that is actually, because yes, I think you and others have articulated quite interesting critiques of the climate movement, especially Extinction Rebellion, and that the critique is basically that they do not understand the realities of the majority of the people, but also that they do not think about power, they do not think about the state, they are just asking do something, but they do not propose what, even though that is actually changing now. So all of that might be, actually useful critique. But I have to say that it goes sometimes quite far, and I think it's not very useful to slam them that hard, actually, because they are movements that have organized, they are motivated, they are also making sacrifices, and you can always ridicule that, but it's people who are actually trying to do something in a movement. And I really like the idea of creating new alliances. So it seems to me that this struggle can only be won if create new, really broad alliances. So green, red alliances, or, you know, with the climate movement and the labor movements have to really work together. So while we might bring in useful theories from you know, the leftist tradition, broadly conceived, like thinking about power, thinking about organization and so on, there are also things we might leave at the door. So one of them would be that suspicion, I think, of education. I think it's not useful, and yeah, it's unbecoming. and the other one, and it's also a bad heritage of the 20th century leftism, if we just say it like that. And the other one is the tendency to like pick the enemy that is really close to you, and then focus all your energy on that. So I think, you know, the critique of Extinction Rebellion and so on, and the climate movement, it's warranted and it's good and it's useful, but let's also be a little bit more generous towards them and sort of invite them or create something together, because that is the climate movement that we actually have. So we might want to work from that. Yeah, that was my point.
I want to say that in your book you criticize the professional managerial class, and we don't have really a good Swedish word for that. Could you maybe explain what you mean with the PMC? Oh, Staffan.
Yeah, but you may answer that question first.
Yeah, sure.
So briefly, it became a quite controversial concept, particularly in the United States with the 2020 Democratic Party campaign. It became quite polarizing, but essentially I define it simply as a class of people that try to marshal credentials to carve out advantages in the labor market. And so typically we're talking about degrees, but also licenses and other kinds of professionalized forms of organization that give people a certain privileged position in the labor market, a labor market that's been defined by skyrocketing inequality and the erosion of middle class security, including for some of these so-called professionals.
And why do you hate them?
I do not hate them. What I argue in the book is that this class of people tends to, interact with and talk politics in kind of cultural bubbles that are not quite insular, and not really thinking about how do we form a politics that actually can reach outward towards the larger masses of people. Because one of the other main definitional points about the professional class is people who are highly educated with advanced degrees are a stark minority of the population, and that they can be, again, somewhat insular and not what I'm trying to do, and I've been called out by others for being too harsh, is that get people to just think a little more reflexively about how narrow their life experience is and how it's quite different from a larger mass of people. And what was, so I mean, damn, I had one other point to answer you. I mean, I actually think 20th century leftism was founded in deep education.
Yes.
And so there were
Exactly.
things called party schools that labor parties did that educated their members about class struggle and Marxism. And these were not ivory tower education, right? And that's one of the problems. The left today has become quarantined in universities and institutions of higher education, but the old kind of working class politics that agree we can't repeat, but that we need to learn a bit from, was a more mass education trying to do that. So I have other points, but maybe I'll think about them later.
Let's Staffan reply now.
Yeah, first of all, I think we agree on most of the description of the present state of capitalism and inequality and all that stuff. So I shouldn't argue with you on that. But to get some intensity in the discussion, I think we should focus on your Marxian interpretation of the period after the Second World War. I think your Marxist reading of Marx Marx here is old-fashioned. And the basic thing is the period after the Second World War is a period of rapid increase of fossil fuels, of not of natural resources, and a dramatic increase of use of fossil fuels emitting of carbon dioxide for the whole population and all actors, workers as well as whatever you call them, capitalists. This phase, that means what we have seen is that we have in our part of the world been jumping up the ladder away from basic reproduction as it's interpreted by Marx. That means this is not only a question of reproduction, that people take their flight to Thailand to have some vacancies, that they travel by car all over the world and things like that. So we have left that behind us, and that is the problem. That the US normal worker emits about 15 tons carbon dioxide a year, or something like that, and the Swedes 6 or 10 or 7, and then you can have some differences in calculations. And of course, that will not change if you argue for moving from a capitalist to a socialist society. There is a risk that they will be losing this. They are scared of losing this level of life, so to say. And I think that is what you are missing in your analysis. This is not a question of reproduction of the working class. It is a question which is above that. And that is, that's the reason why I put this on the basic thing of belief all over society, by workers as well as capitalists, as man, as master of nature. So let us solve that problem first, getting rid of all this excess carbon dioxide emissions. And then we come back to a debate of whether we should have socialism or capitalism.
Okay.
Okay. So is your socialism in one sector paraphrase of from Stalin? Is that old-fashioned?
Yeah, it's a very cheeky analysis. If I can quickly go back to the thing I forgot to say, which is that I actually I don't think by critiquing or slamming the climate movement, I don't think I'm going to push them away from the climate movement. You know, I think we have them as a core constituency that are organizing, and they're doing heroic work, like the Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg. I mean, they're doing great stuff, and they're inspiring people. But again, like, my critique is not going to say, well, now I'm done doing climate politics, right? So my main point is we actually need to massively expand this movement to much broader spectrums of society. And I will say I wrote the book from a tremendous point of just anger about the fact that we've known about this crisis for decades. We're not doing anything about it. And my daughter was born in 2015, and that's kind of the impetus. I mean, it's kind of cliche at this point. When you have a child and you think about she's going to reach retirement age in 2080, it's just terrifying to think about the world she's going to inherit. So the anger about the climate movement's simultaneous sort of self-satisfaction with itself and incapacity to actually structurally change society in the ways they want to really made me angry. So that there is a polemical and angry part of the analysis that I think might go too far sometimes, but that's where I was coming from, and kind of taking the Marxist slogan where he called for a ruthless critique of all things existing, and this kind of criticism for the sake of moving politics forward.
But then interruption. The workers and the trade unions are more or less absent in climate struggle all over the world. Well, I mean, these small groups are much more intensive than is the case with the trade unions.
I mean, in the United States, at least, where I'm familiar, the unions are actually they've been quite invested in pushing the Biden administration for legislation that would be about decarbonization. And, you know, it's not often in the ways that the environmental movement wants it. They promote things like nuclear power that are not popular amongst environmental movements, but they have pushed for a whole suite of technologies that scientists actually say we're going to need to do this Herculean thing to get to net zero by 2050. We're going to need a wide spectrum of technologies, and unions are generally more broad-based in the types of technologies they are fighting for. But to go back to your original critique, I think the first book I wrote, called Lifeblood, actually is a story of how the working class attempt to really challenge the power of capital over production, which is ultimately what socialism to me means. It means We want a society in which we can democratically control the economy and the production system and actually collectively decide how much energy do we need, how much do people have a right to housing and food? I would say yes, they should. Healthcare, these things. And so there was a huge working class insurgency to challenge the power of capital over our economy and production. And the book argues that to pacify that challenge, they created this kind of, compromise between the labor unions and the welfare state and the working class. In the United States, they basically dispersed the power of the working class to these spread out, atomized suburbs where everyone kind of got this emancipated way of life in the realm of consumption, but still had no power or freedom over their workplace, over their production sphere, where capital ruled still. And so the compromise will give you this nice little suburban life, but we maintain control over production. And so from that moment forward, that post-war era you mentioned, we're still stuck with a great acceleration and an Anthropocene moment that is fundamentally driven by, again, I'm repeating myself, but the owners of the production system who are driving our planet to the brink because of their narrow-minded focus on, not just profit, but making sure shareholders get quarterly returns and dividends at the short-termism of the capitalist class is so blinkered and narrow and not in line with any kind of collective sanity for what we need to do. So I'm saying this over and over again, but we're not going to be able to implement the kind of structural transformations unless we challenge their control over the economy like we did briefly in that kind of revolutionary interwar period, and then it didn't quite work out. That came close in Sweden, didn't
it? Staffan, in your books, you doesn't write very much about the taking on the fossil industry, like how do we get stranded assets, and what do you think of that question? Or am I reading you wrong? You can tell me that as well.
Have you read all three of them?
Yeah, I've read all three of them. The first one was quite a long time ago.
Yeah, but I think in fact, I have written about those. The fundamental thing is that about 90% of all fossil reserves in the ground must be kept there. Roughly. It is somewhat different between the oil and coal and gas, of course, but roughly. So we are the fundamental problem here. We are not running out of fossil fuels. In fact, we are not running out of iron ore or something else. We are, as regards fossil fuels, we are running out of the atmosphere to put the carbon dioxide in. That is the fundamental problem. And that is related, of course, to stranded assets. And I think more firms have identified it. But of course, we have a struggle here within capitalism. I mean, I think we are not totally against each other on every point. I read the other day in the newspaper that the Swedish banks, for example, had just recently put about 40 billion Swedish crowns into oil extraction in Norway in the Arctic fields decently. I mean, they should have put zeros. So of course that is an internal struggle within the industry. So I would say there is a clean part of the industry and there is a dirty part of the industry. And in fact, both may be capitalists, both may be looking to get profits, and maybe the clean part has listened more to their daughters in the kitchen table on what they do in this situation. But so I mean, it isn't homogeneous. Capitalist, the industry is not homogeneous, and that is part of my argument. We are not homogeneous among citizens, and the capitalist structure is not homogeneous, and that is what
it's a class struggle between different capitalists as well. You can say maybe.
There are internal struggles in all segments, but that changes the agenda Matt is writing about. I argue.
Okay, so Okay, so we don't have I feel that the debate has only started, but we haven't got very much time left. So, okay, I ask another kind of question to all of you. What kind of climate struggle is most important now, and what is the best thing that ordinary people could do? Should you join an Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, a trade union, maybe a political party? We take it down on the individual level. Some people here are
what political party do you think on?
Which one do you prefer? Sure, feel free.
Is that on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I struggle with this because I teach students, and I teach them about the terrifying nature of climate change, and I'm often confronted with students that are like, "What can I do?" Right? And for a while, you know, you're always struck with this question about what can you do in your personal life, and it becomes a question of, like, you know, getting an electric vehicle, or you know, getting a heat pump for your home, or these individual personal actions to lower your carbon footprint, which British Petroleum will tweet about. Hey, figure out how you can lower your carbon footprint, because they're very invested in this narrative. And I think all that stuff is fine. I have solar panels and a heat pump. I do this stuff. We all do it. It's important, and it's also important to talk about our friends and neighbors about why these lifestyle actions are, you know, educational in a way. But I think lately, you can actually say a much more clear thing to people about what to do, and the answer is organize, right? And that's something that actually I've learned the hard way. It takes a lot of hard work, you know, day in, day out, like grunt work. Organizing is grunt work. So I don't want to be too prescriptive about what organization to join. I mean, I'm a fan of unions and socialist organizations or parties that are, again, very consciously trying to build power, organizational power against capital, right? That's what those things are good at. But of course, there's other types of environmental organizations and other types of groups, but and those can be fine too. But I think if you are in your everyday life trying to build an organization that's trying to, again, sort of build a movement, that's what you can do in your life, and that's way more important than putting the compost away and stuff like that.
Staffan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I will continue on the same thing. First of all, on an individual level, I say you should start with try to half your footprints. That is possible even within the existing system. The other half, we need help from the system, and we have to political struggle and things like that. But you can start. That's one thing. Secondly, I argue, and in fact, I have the same position as Greta Thunberg. It is possible to start with small actions and that they can expand. She said once that if one 15-year-old girl can start such an enormous movement as I have done, everyone can contribute and start from the beginning. And I have been teaching in innovation theory. That is the role of innovations also. They change the playground if you introduce them. You should always try to change the playground. In addition, and then I think it's important, that is break the whole, discussion on what goals do we have for 2040 and 2050 and 2055. All those who formulate those goals will be either retired or dead by that time. So the only thing which matters is formulate goals for 1, 2, or 3 years. So my mantra is, we have to argue for 7 or 8 or 9 or 10% reduction of carbon dioxide emissions for every year starting from now. And those who are against it should argue what is the alternative. Yes. Not arguing for 2040. 7%, and that is a tough thing which will impact on everything from now. And I think we can do it in our political parties, in our companies, and in other places. So that is an individual thing we can work with. 7% at least. Kevin Anderson will say twice that amount, but we should start at least with 7% a year.
And that is a great end. If you don't have anything to add, Julia.
No, I had a small thing, and that is that I agree that we should, organize. And my experience with climate movements and environmental movements in this country is that they are people are very committed, but they are also very committed to their own scheme and their own organization. And there are so many initiatives, and people just, when you feel like you have to do something, you start a new movement. And that is just a version in the extreme of individualism, actually. Each of us, make up our own movement. So I think that would be, at least, in Sweden and probably in other places too, that would be a good place to start networking between all those organizations and initiatives, and try to, bring them together, and then stitch this larger coalition with perhaps the labor movements and the unions and so on. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I would like to say that in Germany, the Green movement and the labor unions have been quite on the same page with very much things as well. Okay, so everyone, is there any questions to the panel here?
Hi. Hi. Thank you. Really interesting and rich discussion. Something that I didn't hear mentioned so far today is the question of internationalism versus nationalism. Right now in the United States, the Biden administration is articulating plans for renewable energy transition, specifically securing critical mineral supplies, very directly along the lines of preparing for war against China. What are your thoughts on that sort of nationalist articulation of climate policy goals?
Do we have another hour to discuss?
Who wants to answer? Matt.
Well, I hate to be, saying the same stuff, but and again, we can't repeat history, but there was this movement for socialism that was grounded in internationalism and workers of the world uniting, and that spirit, I think, we've very much lost. But there is this, if you go back to the powerful moments of the working class movement, this feeling that this movement was actually a movement to abolish capitalism, to liberate all of humanity from a class society and actually deliver freedom to humanity. And so I actually think we can think about the impacts of geopolitical imperialist sort of conflicts over minerals and stuff like that. But there was also a tradition of anti-imperialism in this movement that was trying to, again, say it's really the capitalist states that are in these rivalries, and we need to unite workers across to oppose war and oppose imperialism on these principles. And like in the more sort of nitty-gritty of extraction, I think we have to think about how workers can actually build power over these kind of mineral supply chains. So, in Mexico recently, the left-wing president AMLO actually nationalized the lithium reserves, and how that policy alongside sort of empowering the labor unions in Mexico might be a different way to think about a worker-led kind of green extraction regime. And of course, much of Latin America, including just a couple days ago, is now under a sort of left power and state control. So there's, I think, an opportunity to think proactively about connecting that internationalism. And also, I think we need to bring out that as much as we need to really fundamentally transform the kind of fossil fuel lifestyles that Stefan is talking about, we actually still live in a world where 800 million people have zero electricity on this planet, and 3.3 billion people have they use less electricity per year than your refrigerator. So that's almost half of humanity. And so a good old guy named Lenin said that communism was worker power plus electrification of the whole country. And he actually, when they won power in Russia, one of his first priorities was to electrify the countryside, because he saw that if you can bring this kind of magic stuff that we all take for granted, that's powering this weird thing on my face and these lights, and if you can bring this stuff to the poor, downtrodden masses of people, that you can help win them over to this, again, very sort of emancipatory project. And I think there's still so much deprivation. We call it energy poverty around the world. And if we can actually have a project that's about solving energy poverty through decarbonized zero carbon electricity, I think that can inspire masses of people around the world for that kind of internationalist project.
You have your answer there. Do like Lenin did. Okay, Staffan, you have written a lot about the welfare state and the thing about the borders.
We don't have so much time, but I basically agree with you also there. I think the neoliberal globalized world has peaked, and we are moving somewhat down, and we have recognized a lot of disadvantages, even those who originally was in favor of it. In fact, I read a long read in Financial Times about that the other day on how to get away from the globalized world in Financial Times. The problem now, I think, is what I think you were thinking on, that is to prevent that we move to another end of very narrow-minded nationalism, which would be a catastrophe. We must find a way to combine national systems working in a globalized world that we can at least have exchange with each other on different ways. I think we are struggling on that, and that is we can't discuss more on this here.
Okay. Yeah. Do we have any other questions in the audience?
Thank you. I haven't read your book, Matt, but I was thinking when you're talking about the means of production being in the hands of workers, and you've talked about profit, which is in the post-growth literature, you have not-for-profit research, you have that kind of initiatives, but what would it change to be nationalized, or if there's still a profit motive in the end? Because I guess the extractivists, because I think we shouldn't talk only about climate, but also all the natural resources that are used. So I was not sure what you meant. How would that be different?
So, like, we know, like, there's a whole nonprofit sector in the world, and a lot of... Okay, not for profit. And
it's not shareholders. You have a researcher called Jennifer Hinton. She's been researching on not-for-profit companies. So it could be a market, but you're not. It's not profit that you as a goal. You don't have that. It's societal good is your goal.
Sure.
So it's not non-profit organizations or anything. It's not-for-profit companies.
Would that be similar to like worker co-ops? Because we have those.
Cooperatives
are
not necessarily not-for-profit,
sure.
But there are some not-for-profit. Sure. But I think profit is maybe what drives environmental bads in the capitalist system. So.
What I would like to see is an energy, because this is mostly about energy, the energy sector, and right now, too much for me of the energy sector is run for profit. And so we have to think about different models of ownership that could be worker co-ops or non-for-profit or state public ownership, where there can be wider criteria of what you're doing in the productive sphere. What's the goal, right? Because if it's narrowly going to be profit, then it really just it just completely puts off the table a much more robust. And ultimately, it's also usually when it's for profit, it's quite anti-democratic, right? Because it's run by a board of directors who are again seeking to serve their shareholders above all else. So I think we can be quite open-minded about different kind of experimental ownership models that can again bring in more democratic types of governance systems and models. But you know. In the left today, there's often a lot of focus on co-ops and small-scale, like community ownership of energy systems, and that I think sometimes can not quite be up to the challenge we're facing that Stefan and Julia are talking about, where we really have to like drastically restructure our energy system in the course of, if we're going to do 7% reductions a year, it's not clear to me it can be done with a bunch of scattered little co-ops and local. So we actually need to think about how do we actually build much more large-scale forms of ownership and investment, but that are also possibly public or collective, where you can actually have, or worker-owned, in ways that can actually catalyze much more large-scale investments and transformations. Because sometimes the problem with capitalism is if you have a lot of these alternatives that are just scattered in these little local areas, they can be just left there and it can be to themselves while the whole system just keeps on running. So I think we have to think big about these alternatives. So.
Question there.
Hi, I'm going to try to formulate this well in English. I'll try my best. You talk a lot about like organizing and unionizing in order to make that change happen, like Greta did, for example, and like go together. But we also live in a society today that's very capitalistic and individualized and focused on like short term. And our society is very fragmentized in that way. And people are not being in the unions in the same way. And we need to have dramatic changes on a very short time, but we also need like a long-term perspective. So therefore I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how we mobilize this organization, both with like a really short-term profit for the climate movement, but as well long-term?
Yes. Yes, thank you for that question. I think that is one of the central points actually for the degrowth crowd, for their argument that you're supposed to decommodify certain social goods. So the thing you talked about, that individualism and sort of loneliness, the loneliness epidemic and lack of meaning and all these, modern ills that we like to talk about now and so on. So that is a big part of that argument, I think, that you should have more time and often the analysis goes to what do people actually value in life and so on, and how can we make more space for that. So I think, and a large part of that would also be sort of community and conviviality and being together with others and doing things like that. So, yeah, I mean, that is part of the, I think, degrowth argument, that you can have a less strained life where you don't have to spend your whole day just making a living and so on. And that is, of course, one of the possible opportunities of transformation, and not just sort of replacing your power source.
But how do we organize people around that?
Yeah, good question.
Give us the answer.
I think
Big sorry.
Matt has a very good point in the book, that you have to, if this is the point, but that you have to sort of package things together. So you can't just propose one policy here and one policy there, but you have to sort of make a package that can appeal to a large enough amount of people or of the electorate, so that so one way of organizing around that would be to sort of join up, but not just with people who have the exact same policy agenda, but more broadly, and then see how you can perhaps create a package that would be electable for a larger part of the voters.
If I can quickly...
Yeah, sure, Ed.
That I think you lay out just the core problem we face, that the Vivek Chibber, who's a scholar who was actually here in this building on Sunday, he has this new book where he argues that under capitalism, workers are are not really prone to consent to capitalist power, but they're actually more prone to what he calls resignation. This sort of feeling that things are bad and things are corrupt, but there's nothing I can do about it, and I'm atomized, I'm individualized. And
the class matrix.
Yeah, the book is called The Class Matrix. And so getting workers out of that resignation and into collective action is hard. If you read the book, you'll see clearly I'm highly influenced by a thinker named Jane McAlevey, who's a labor organizer. She wrote a book called Raising Expectations and Raising Hell. and the key point of raising expectations is that when workers start collectively organizing and they start winning, they start to sort of raise their expectations about what's possible, what actually power can accomplish for them in their lives. And it's building that confidence in an organizing space that I think can take on a life of its own. And obviously, you know, there could be one perspective that could say, well, to build that kind of power and organizing, it's going to take decades, right? And that might be true, and we don't really have decades. But you can also kind of understand that there can be historical moments of rupture or crisis or opportunities where organizations can kind of sort of catalyze into a big growth and a big movement. In fact, what she analyzes is the incredible burst of the power of the labor movement in the 1930s. But if you go back just like to the late 1920s, the labor movement was not like, it was actually quite disorganized and not building that confidence. And so there can be opportunities to have a actually fast, short-term explosion of a kind of working class upsurge. But to get the upsurge, you actually have to do that grunt work of building the organizations to be ready to take advantage of those moments. We've seen a lot of these moments in the United States, like the George Floyd uprising, where more people went out on the streets than ever before, but there wasn't just like infrastructure to channel all that anger into kind of a movement and an organization that's actually trying to actually achieve real concrete changes. So it's not easy, and it's actually easier for people to just be resigned and individualized. But again, we know we can do it. Humans have accomplished incredible social movements all throughout history that have challenged power systems and overcome them. So we know this can work. We've been in a rough few decades, but we need to kind of get out of our rut and get back to work.
So raise hell. Okay, is it any more questions, or are we out of time maybe? I don't know. One more minute, okay. One more question.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, of course, to listen to the discussion, and I really felt sort of motivated by Matt's argument there on including the unions and building a broader coalition with not just the climate activists, but also having the unions there. I believe that the climate transformation, as you put it, is really an opportunity to break the negative circles that we've had on capitalism moving forward and inequalities rising, because we need to transform our economy. It's also an opportunity to transform the current belief system of capitalism. But I wanted to ask Julia actually on the degrowth policy and how it would impact the income inequality. I believe when the growth is quite high, there is a higher opportunity for that to reduce inequalities. What do you think would happen if we pursue that policy, and how would we avoid that leading to increased inequalities? Thank you.
I think that's a really great question, and is a guy named Lee Phillips has written a book that's called Austerity Ecology, about the connection between degrowth and austerity politics. And austerity politics is some degrowthers are pro some kind of austerity. What do you say about that? Are you pro austerity?
That's a very good, of course, critique, and I think one way of answering it would be that austerity has its goal to sort of lower public spending, right, or to cut it or restrain it, and that is not the goal of degrowth. So that would instead be focusing on the social goods that we actually have identified politically that are good. So mobility, or more time, or whatever that could be. So the idea then is to, on the one hand, sort of decommodify more social goods, so that you do not actually have to have that high an income to get those things. So public health, for example. So you don't have to be in this country. You don't have to have a very high income to get access to good healthcare. You just have to live in the right place. But yeah, that's for another discussion. But yes, so that is the idea. That so decommodification is one thing, and then the difference with austerity, I think, is quite important to underline, and it is there because it's not about sort of cutting public spending to regain some kind of confidence from the market or something like that. It's not about that. It's about cutting emissions and lowering other environmental impacts while boosting these social goods or functions in the economy that have actually been prioritized. So but that is, I mean, it's also a problem that that question is always asked, of course, because it does look similar, and that's not good, as you also point out.
And I want to say a thing. It's a recent book on Swedish by Richard Varlenius, Klimatet, tillväxten och kapitalismen, tror jag den heter. The Climate, the Growth and Capitalism. A really, really good book. And he is like you, like Marxian. He has a Marxian perspective, but he is admitting that the degrowth movement has made a really, really big, important thing in the debate, and that the conflict between the modernist traditions and the degrowth is kind of artificial sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think that is quite important to repeat that the degrowth movement is also a movement about social transformation. So yeah.
Just one quick thing, that the unfortunate thing is the only time in history where we've been able to invest in public goods and social goods and redistribute wealth towards more people in a kind of welfare system. So I'm totally on board with the degrowth commitment to universal public goods and decommodification, awesome. But the only time we've done that in history is during the post-World War II era, which was the highest era of growth in maybe capitalist history. So I think the question really hits the only times in which capitalists will allow that level of decommodification in social goods is when there's so much growth they can have their profits too, right? And so unless we want to have a high-growth, redistributive economy that decommodifies and then tries to solve the climate crisis in this high growth thing, if we don't want that, then I think we again, broken record, we have to actually not allow capital to still control the productive sphere in the economy and get their profits while they redistribute some to welfare state. We actually have to challenge their fundamental control over the economy itself, and that's obviously it's a heavier lift. It's a revolutionary confrontation with the power of private capital over our economy. But if you want the decommodification to come through without the high growth, that's what you got to do. So,
Staffan want to say a last
a
thing.
very short comment. I think the only people who believe in economic growth forever are economists. Standard economists, I think. I mean, basically.
And Lee Phillips also believes.
Yeah, maybe.
But he's maybe the only one. I don't know.
I mean, it is impossible in the long run to have an exponential economic growth, of course. Maybe you can have it in the computer when you add new figures in the records, but that's the only thing. And we are now on the second half of the chessboard. I mean, the doubling time all after the Second World War for more or less everything was 25 years. For oil, for coal, for iron ore, for copper, etc. 25 years up to now. You can't double it once more, and especially you can't double the emissions in the atmosphere. So I mean, there are limits to growth, irrespective of whether people or economists or company performers or others want. It isn't possible to continue on the great acceleration as we had after the Second World War. We will face another world. Then we have to control it, of course, rather than just let it happen.
Thank you very much to all of you, and thanks to the audience.